What's up, guys? It is the Bluebloods here coming at y'all with another episode of our SEC in 30 Days theme. We are joined by South Carolina insider, writer for the state newspaper, Ben Portnoy is joining us today. And I just want to say I appreciate you coming on the show, man.
Yeah, Zach, happy to do it. Thanks for having me, man.
Absolutely. So we got to get into last season. I know it wasn't the best for the Gamecocks. 2-8 really kind of led to Will Muschamp's departure from South Carolina, firing, whatever you want to call it. I usually ask whether it met, exceeded expectations. I know this is far short of the standard of South Carolina. So I want to kind of rephrase that and ask you, what really went wrong for the 2020 South Carolina Gamecocks?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at it, I think the biggest thing is when you look at it is defense. I think that, that's something that Will Muschamp prided himself on, and it just never quite got there. You had some injuries. Israel Mukwamu wasn't healthy most of the year. J.C. Horn was in and out a little bit, didn't play the last couple of games. Now, that was after Muschamp was fired, but still, you lose guys like that, and you're going to be down, you're going to be having some trouble. And, when you look at that and that kind of thing, I think that, you look at the game against Ole Miss, for example, where they give up, over 50 points and a ton of yards. And, it kind of boils down to, what do you expect the South Carolina team to be? And when the defense wasn't there, when that's something that, I think that your head coach prided himself on, that was a problem. The offense wasn't quite there. There were some flashes. Kevin Harris ran for over 1,000 yards and looked really good doing it. And there were little bits and pieces. Colin Hill was fine, I think. It wasn't great and it wasn't the perfect experiment. Ryan Olinsky was hurt and Luke Doty got some time. And it was just kind of a little bit of you just had a lot of inconsistency all over the board. And, and they never really put it together, frankly.
Right. We talked Will Muschamp leaves because of this season, really. Shane Beamer gets his first head coaching opportunity for the Gamecocks, comes to South Carolina, where he spent 3 years under one of the best offensive minds in Lincoln Riley over at Oklahoma. Plus his dad, probably the most legendary coach in Virginia Tech history, and Frank Beamer. Why was he the guy? Why was Beamer the guy for South Carolina? And for you, what are your expectations for him moving forward for South Carolina?
Yeah, I think that, when you look at Shane, he had a lot of alumni support. He had a lot of former player support and that kind of thing. There were a lot of guys that were interviewed through this process. Scott Satterfeld at Louisville, Jamie Chadwell at Coastal Carolina, Skip Holtz. Billy Napier was pretty heavily involved here too. But I think that when you look at it, Shane Beamer is a guy that's charismatic. He's kind of the polar opposite of Lincoln Riley, of Will Muschamp. If you look at it, he's a little more extroverted. He's a guy who likes, being out and about and with people, whereas Will's a little more reserved and quieter and more introverted. And, like you said, coming from Oklahoma, Shane was at Oklahoma. He was at Georgia before that. He was at Virginia Tech. He's been at Tennessee as a graduate assistant. He's been at some of the biggest programs in America. And, I think the big knock with Shane is that, yeah, he's a coach's kid and he hasn't been a coordinator. And I think that, you can pick quarrels with that, I guess. But I think that when you look at it, Shane's kind of it's super cliche, but he's a culture guy, right? Like he's a guy that I think, people rally around. I think that people here have rallied around pretty quickly. And I think, people tend to enjoy being around, right? There's a lot of, I think there's a lot of insanity around college football and, not necessarily a whole lot of transparency. And I think, as far as, we've dealt with Shane, he's been super transparent with us. And I think that's refreshing. And, he's one of these guys that, what you see is what you get. And I think that's, a big pull for South Carolina. And he's a guy who you can rally around. Like I said, he's a guy that I think draws people out and gets people excited and kind of rallies the troops a little bit.
Yeah, he does. I thought it was one of the better hires. I know it's always a big what if when you get a first-time head coach, especially in the SEC where, let's just be honest, it's the most brutal division in college football. So he's going to get his feet wet real quick at South Carolina. But the first big decision for Beamer is who's going to be QB1 for this offense next year. Luke Doty, Jason Brown, Colton Gaither are all fighting for this spot. I know it's kind of really a two-man race, but I always like the third name because you never know with the first-time head coach. They're going to spend time, summer workouts, fall camps, all fighting for this position. For you, just on the inside knowledge, who is your favorite for QB1, and what do each of these guys really bring to the table for South Carolina?
Yeah, so coming out of camp, Shane Beamer said that Luke Doty will be the number one quarterback, at least going forward. And, frankly, barring something unforeseen, I think that's probably where this ends up. I mean, hypothetically, you've still got summer workouts and camp, and I think Jason Brown's an interesting piece. I mean, he did play really well in the spring game for what that's worth, but it's a spring game, so you can only take so much from that, right? But I think this is Luke Doty's job going forward. I think he'll be the first quarterback off the bench, and when they open the season against, was it Eastern Illinois? And I think that that's the guy to watch. He's a former top 100 recruit. He's from Myrtle Beach. He put up some crazy numbers in high school and is a guy that I think has a lot of potential. I'm not sure we've seen a lot of Luke, throwing the ball, but he's got some ability as an athlete. He's a dual threat guy. And I think he kind of fits nicely with what they're going to want to do. I don't think you're going to see him asked to do a lot in the passing game, and I don't think that's because he can't. I think it's just a matter of, it's going to be a first-year starter, right? You don't want to put too much on that guy. I think you realistically probably see some play action. You see some simple throws. You see a lot of intermediate routes. You probably see some deep shots just to keep the defense honest. But, this isn't going to be a team that throws the ball, 50 times a game. I think you're probably going to see more of like a 60-40 split, run versus pass. And I think Luke's a guy that can be a little bit of a game manager and handle that running component as well.
Right. And I mean, going from a defensive-minded head coach in Muschamp to an offensive-minded in Beamer, how different do you think, just as a scheme, from a scheme perspective, do you expect this offense to be in 2021 and moving forward?
I think it'll be pretty multiple. I think you'll see a lot of different things. I think that, Marcus Satterfeld, who's the offensive coordinator here, who's coming from the Carolina Panthers. He's worked with Matt Rule for a long time. He worked with Joe Brady in Carolina for a year. And, we all know what that offense did at LSU a couple of years ago. And, Marcus has said before, this year that, we're not out here trying to be 2019 LSU. Sure, we'd like to be, but that's, right. That's ridiculous to try and say that we're going to do that. That's one of the best offenses that we've seen in college football. And so, that said, I think it's going to be multiple. I think you'll see them, swinging the ball around. I think you're going to see guys in space. I think you're going to see a lot of intermediate routes, but you've also got a lot of running backs that you can make, you can make things happen with. Kevin Harris is the guy coming back, but, Marshawn Lloyd was a borderline 5-star recruit in the class of 2020, I guess now. Yeah. And blew out his knee in training camp last year and didn't see the field. Zaquandre White's a former Florida State guy who transferred and has been in the mix a little bit, but looked really, really good in the spring game and has been a guy that's been raved about all year. And, don't be surprised if Kevin Harris ends up being the second or third guy off the bench at running back just because of how deep they are at that position. So, I think you'll see them rely a little bit heavier on the run game this year. Now, that may be different a year from now, just depending on who's here and what's what. But I think that you'll see some multiple looks. I don't think you're going to see, I think it'll be some spread concepts and that kind of thing. And you'll try and throw the ball around a little bit to keep the defense honest. But this team's going to live and die by the run game, I think, just because that's where the strengths lie.
Right. Yeah. That for Harris to fall all the way to third string would be crazy because he really was showing out toward the end of last year. But, I want it all starts with the recruiting trail. If any head coach is going to come in and be successful, they're going to have to recruit. The 2022 class is looking really nice, but I want to talk more about the kids we're going to see on campus this year. The 2021 class was really affected by the coaching change with early signing day, COVID, no visits, you couldn't do anything. Top 80, though, still headlined by TJ Sanders, was one of the biggest signees in that class out of the state. What were the biggest positional needs, though, for the Gamecocks? And who are some guys you have your eyes on as instant impact guys?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing with this group is beyond the high school guys, is you brought in a lot of transfers, right? Carlin Platel is a guy that comes from the D2 level and has played a lot of snaps and is a guy that I think will see a lot of time in the secondary. Tavarian Scott, who's a linebacker out of Dodge City Community College, is a guy that I think that once he's on campus will be a guy that can see some time. Any of those JUCO guys, I think you sign them and you expect them to step in right away. That said, you've also got some other guys, Marion Brown at receiver, David Spalding at cornerback, Jordan Strawn at linebacker. Those are all guys that are going to see a lot of time. But I think the biggest one, frankly, is, no pun intended, is EJ Jenkins. He's a guy who's 6'7", 250 plus, and is really a matchup nightmare. He's been running with receivers and tight ends through spring ball and into summer, and is a guy that had a couple of touchdown catches when they did red zone stuff during the spring game, and that's a small sample size, but is a guy that there aren't a hell of a lot of people out there that can match up with a 6'7" guy who's that big. I mean, he looks the part, and if you have a guy like that out there, I mean, it helps Luke Doty as a first-year quarterback and things like that. But, with what South Carolina has at receiver, which isn't a lot, I think you've got, a lot of unproven guys and just not a ton of depth there. Maybe you might see 8 or 9 guys rotate, but I think it's more a product of that, South Carolina's figuring out who's there and who can make plays as much as anything. But I think that E.J. Jenkins is probably the newcomer that makes the biggest impact this year if I had to pick one.
Right. I mean, you're seeing more and more that coaches are willing to put freshmen out there and that they're really coming more college ready just from these high schools that are really I mean, you look at any kid coming out of like IMG, those guys are already college athletes as juniors and seniors. But I want to shift toward next season, man. The 2021 season is going to be interesting, and South Carolina had a lot of departures. You look at J.C. Horn headed to the NFL draft being the biggest one. What players on the roster right now do you have your eye on and think could really shine and have their breakout years in 2021?
I mean, if you're looking at cornerback, I really like Cam Smith. I think he's a guy that's really talented. He's had some really big plays, through the last, year, 2 years. I mean, he's a guy that I think is really, really gifted and can be a problem at cornerback. And naturally is a nice replacement for JC. I mean, he's a guy that played a lot of snaps last year and, had a few issues in coverage, got beat, one too many times, and is a guy that was still young, right? And still kind of learning the position. But, when you're playing opposite JC Horn, that's a good guy to be around, generally speaking. And I think he's a guy that I'm really high on. And I think, is a guy that I would point to pretty quickly. I think Karan Prunty as well, who's a guy that just committed to South Carolina. I guess it was yesterday, within the last 2 days. Who's coming out of Kansas, is a guy that, who didn't allow a touchdown pass against him at a program like Kansas. You're doing a pretty dang good job, right? And he's a guy that I think steps on campus at day one and might be their best secondary piece. So, he's a guy that's going to have 4 years of eligibility. And I think I saw this, someone said this, he's going to have 4 years of eligibility, but he probably is only going to need 2 to get to the next level. So, he's a guy that I think steps in quickly and is a guy that can make some big plays in that secondary. And I think that, that's the biggest question mark on this team is that, can you completely avoid disaster of winning, 2 games this year? If you're going to do that, and if you want to make the steps toward, 4, 5, 6 wins, if things break perfectly and you want to try and make a run at a bowl game, like that secondary is going to have to shore up. And I think that if it doesn't, the South Carolina team's in for a long season because, they're going to have trouble stopping some of the offenses that they're going to see. But, if there are guys like a Cam Smith or Karan Prunty who comes in and makes it, make an impact, like you've got a shot.
Right. I mean, yeah, that secondary was a strength last year. That's kind of where I want to shift to real quick is, J.C. Horn, a top 10 pick. It's back-to-back years where South Carolina had top 10 picks with Javon Kinlaw coming out the year before. He really shined at the Senior Bowl. He was one of our favorite players while we were down there covering that. For J.C. Horn, though, specifically, he kind of had a breakout year. Anyone who wasn't really covering South Carolina, covering college football, really probably didn't know his name going into last year. To go to the 8th pick is crazy. What makes Horn such a special player? And just for you covering him at South Carolina, what is his NFL potential really going to be?
Yeah, to be fair, I didn't cover a lot of JC. I'm pretty new here too, but I think he's a guy that is physical. He's got some size. He's long. He's kind of one of those mean, nasty guys out on the corner who's going to lock you up and not give you a lot of space to operate. And I think the knock on JC for a long time was that he didn't have an interception. If I'm not mistaken, he didn't get his first career interception until this year as a junior. So, that I think it was more of a product of the fact that no one was throwing at him versus the fact that he wasn't making plays. I mean, I think if I remember the number right, guys only had about a 25% completion percentage when they threw at JC Horn. So, they may not have targeted him much, but when they did, they weren't making, completing passes. So I think that when you look at a guy like JC, he's big, he's long, he's physical, and I think he just doesn't give you a lot of space to operate. He really makes you uncomfortable getting out of your breaks, and he doesn't give you the space to make a play.
Right. I mean, as an Auburn fan, J.C. Horn has haunted my nightmares for some time. It's a very odd strategy to let Bo Nix throw at him consistently for some reason. I don't know why that was the game plan. I don't even, if I'm not even a football coach, I'd have been like, hey, if I need to go to the other side of the field. But that's just me. But looking ahead to 2021 schedule, man, they got a brutal road ahead. The Gamecocks do. Road games, Georgia, A&M, Missouri, and you still again draw Auburn out of the West. You also have the in-state rival Clemson, and you get Florida on the docket. All 6 of those games are going to be brutally tough. In the first year for Beamer, though, what is the ceiling and or floor for the 2021 South Carolina Gamecocks?
Yeah, I think that, the floor, if everything becomes a disaster and is a problem, you're probably looking at 2 wins. I think I saw yesterday that CBS released that the over-under for South Carolina was about 3.5 wins. The problem that South Carolina runs into, and I think, coming in recently, I think it gives me a chance to look at it a little more objectively just because I'm coming from the outside. Like, you've got to play Clemson every single year as a non-conference game, as opposed to, for example, whatever you want to call it, Arkansas, who can schedule 4 teams out of conference, and, maybe 3 of those are more group of 5 type programs or whatever that is. But, it's basically like adding Alabama twice on your schedule when you're playing Clemson every year. And that kind of thing hurts, So if you're South Carolina, you've got some tricky non-conference games even then, right? You've got Eastern Illinois, you probably roll. You've got Troy, who's been mediocre since Neil Brown left for West Virginia, but is always kind of a pretty decent group of 5 program. And then you've got East Carolina, which is a game that's at East Carolina. It's in Greenville. I think it's week 3, if I'm not mistaken. And, is a game that kind of screams trap game. I think that South Carolina should be able to, South Carolina should win that game 100%, but, it's a game that gets a little dicey and could be a little tricky. And, then you still have Vanderbilt on the schedule. You've got a team in Missouri that a lot of people are high on, but I'm not quite there yet with. I think I'll believe it when I see it. And you've got some other teams. Look, Auburn's in a first year under a new coach. Weird things happen. There are games like that. Texas A&M was really good last year, but, you lose Kellen Mond. Where do they stand? And, you think that the way that they've recruited, they should be all right, but you don't really know till you see it, later into the season. So I think that, if I had to put a number on it, the floor is probably 2 wins. The ceiling's probably about 6, I think, if things break perfectly. I think that, you're probably going to see South Carolina drop another game to Clemson just because I think that the talent gap is, it's not necessarily an indictment on South Carolina. It's as much a sort of manifestation of how good Clemson is and how well they've recruited the last, since, the last decade, basically, and what a machine they've turned into. Right. So, I think that, there are games on this schedule that are winnable. I think that, if you're South Carolina, you circle those 3 non-conference games, you circle Vanderbilt, you circle Missouri, you circle Auburn. There are pieces of that I think that, some of those teams might be more talented on paper, but you feel like you could steal a game here or there. But I think realistically, you're looking at probably a 3 to 4 win team, probably closer to 4. I think that they probably take care of business against the group of 5 teams that they've got to see just because of what they've got on the offensive line and at running back. And I think that they can kind of overpower those teams a little bit. I think that, not that this is a great example, but Vanderbilt was really, bad last year. But, that was a game that South Carolina kind of just ran all over the place and ended up winning that game by about 3 or 4 scores. And so you look at that and you say, okay, that's probably realistically what you're looking at against a group of 5 team like a Troy or an East Carolina or something like that. So I think that they should be able to roll to 3 wins at least, if not 4. And if they get to 5, that's a really, really good start. I think that you just can't let the bottom fall out in year 1. I think that if you can get to 4 wins, that's a pretty good spot to be if you're South Carolina.
Absolutely. And if he gets to 6, his first year makes a bowl game and like possibly wins that bowl game, that would be for me an A+++ year for Beamer in year 1. And yeah, the Clemson rivalry, that's kind of tough because for years South Carolina benefited from having Clemson being their out of conference rival because Clemson was not what they were today. And this is just kind of like a hypothetical question as well. In terms of scheduling, I really like seeing the South Carolina North Carolina matchup. We saw it week 1 a few years back. Is that something the Gamecocks would want to explore and kind of have that be a recurring rivalry game? Like maybe not every year because you still have Clemson, but more common than what it's been in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, from the outside, I think it's a really fun rivalry. I think that it's two teams that are pretty close to each other geographically, and yeah, it's different conferences, but I think it's a nice rivalry game and a game that I think is nice to have. The problem is if you're South Carolina with where you're at and what you're already facing in SEC play, that's not necessarily a game you want to schedule, especially with what Mac Brown's been able to do at North Carolina. And I think that UNC football has an up and down history, but it's still generally speaking a pretty middle of the road Power 5 team, and that's definitely a lot different than playing a middle of the road Group of 5 team, right? And that's no disrespect to the lower levels, but if you're South Carolina, you want to get yourself to bowl eligibility most years. I think that's generally speaking, this is a team that should probably be somewhere between 5 and 7 wins most years when things are rolling. And yeah, maybe you get an uptick here or there where you get to 8 or 9 or 10. And, in perfect situations, you get to the Spurrier years, right? Where you go 11 wins 3 straight years. But that's the only time it's happened in school history. So, you look at that and like, if you're South Carolina, it probably doesn't benefit you to schedule that game. It's great for us from the outside to watch. I think it's a great rivalry there, whatever you want to call it. I think it's a nice game to have on the schedule. And I think it builds a lot of interest in this part of the country. But at the same time, like, I'm not sure how beneficial it is for a team like South Carolina, where you're fighting for bowl eligibility most years and already going to have to compete in the SEC and going to have to face Clemson every year with what Clemson is right now, to just keep scheduling games like that.
Yeah, and when they did schedule it, was one of the best games of the week 1 schedule. I mean, I know they came off on the downside of it, but I mean, it was a really good game, and South Carolina should have won that game.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, potentially. So, this last question here, I mean, I've been to almost every SEC stadium. I actually had a trip that we were going to take for Auburn, South Carolina this year until COVID just said no one can go to any games ever. So I missed my chance, but hopefully, I'll be able to get to William-Brice Stadium soon. But for those who haven't been, what makes Columbia William-Brice Stadium such a unique SEC environment?
Yeah, and to be honest, I haven't covered a game at Williams-Brice yet either. I'm still up the boat here, so I'm learning as I go a little bit. I got a little taste of it during the spring game, which probably isn't a good explanation, but I think that when you look at it, at least from the outside, I think that the thing that's really cool about South Carolina, and I think you get this across the SEC for the most part, is that you've got programs that South Carolina, for example, is one that historically has been pretty middle of the road. They've had some really high highs, but the lows have been pretty low, and even then you're still getting 80,000 people at a ball game every single week. And I think that it's a really passionate fan base. I think that Columbia is a really cool place where you've kind of got a combination of where there's pockets that it feels very college towny. You've got pockets that feel very city-like. And it's kind of this fascinating mix of the two. And I think it's a really cool place. And people in the state love their Gamecocks, that's for sure. So, I think that's a good thing, right? If people are passionate, that's a good thing. I think it's got one of the more passionate fan bases in America, and they're with their team, through the ups and through the downs. And, more recently it's been some downs, but, it's a team that's only a couple of years removed from going 9-4. So, you've got to rebuild the roster a little bit, and that takes time. But I think that, people here are excited about it. I think that, when Williams-Brice opens up for the first game of the Beamer era, it's going to be really exciting. And I think, people are ready for it. And I think you're going to see people out and, ready to see this thing full tilt.
Absolutely. I mean, I know I'm excited. I have like so many trips planned throughout the year. I'm just like, I just want to be in a stadium. I don't even care what stadium it is. I just want to see someone play football live. But man, I appreciate you coming on the show. I know it's a busy time. Baseball just wrapped up. Football season's getting ready to gear back up. So I appreciate it. This is your time though, man. Shout outs. Where can they find you on social media? Where can they find the state? Anything you want to plug, man? This is your time.
Yeah, man. No, you can follow me on Twitter at bportnoy15. Check out what I'm writing, I guess, at the www.thestate.com. So all sorts of good stuff there, and lots of good stuff, coming up through the rest of the off season, and headed toward SEC media days, and training camp's right around the corner now. About a month away, which is pretty crazy, and we'll have lots of good stuff there. So really excited about that.
Yeah, I mean, guys, go check out the state. Go check out Ben. Be sure to follow him on Twitter so you can keep up with all things South Carolina football throughout the season. This is a program that is on the upswing, man. I'm excited for the Beamer era. I can't wait. We'll definitely be reaching back out to you during the season, man. Have to get you back on in the swing of things. But guys, y'all know where to find Ben. Y'all know where to find us. You can subscribe on YouTube now. You can find the audio versions on any and all podcast streaming platforms. This is our last episode of SEC in 30 days. So if you're another fan, make sure to go find your school, and you can find any interview for any conference all the way back to February, man. So this wraps up our conference previews and recaps all summer. But guys, for Ben, for myself, and the Blue Bloods, we are out.